Rome, especially in the early Republic, was dominated by the patricians. The patricians were a class of citizens who were rich, owned most of the land, had their own advantages baked into the very fabric of the Roman state, and only had to compete amongst themselves for the highest offices within Rome. As you can imagine, these advantages led the plebeians, the vast majority of Rome's citizenry, to become jaded and angry as the decades ticked by and the lives of the patricians improved while their own stagnated. This discontent would eventually boil over into what would come to be known as the conflict of the orders. This conflict would last for over 3 centuries, and it would dominate the history of the early Republican period. We've already discussed the first important event in the history of the conflict, that being the first secession of the Plebs. Today, we are going to take a look at one of the most important events in the whole conflict, and perhaps in the history of Rome itself, the establishment of the 12 tables. So what were the 12 tables? Why were they so important? What led to their establishment? And why do I think they are the most consequential pieces of writing in the history of the Roman Republic? Let's talk about it. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Before we can really get into talking about the 12 tables, we should first talk a little bit about the situation between the two social classes of Rome. The patricians had been able to solidify their hold on power by monopolizing control over very nearly every political, societal, and economic position within the Roman government. This had started during the Roman monarchy, when the patricians became the sole class able to hold religious offices. And this, of course, continued into the early Republic, with the patrician dominance of the office of consul, which was essentially the successor to the office of king. They furthered their domination by ensuring that only patricians occupied seats in the Senate, and that the ownership of land was concentrated in patrician hands. Of course, this does not mean that every patrician had a large amount of land, wealth, or political power. However, simply having the distinction of being able to call yourself a patrician accorded a certain amount of prestige and power. In the early 5th century BCE, just after the fall of the monarchy, the plebeians began to face a new problem. That problem was called the nexium. The nexium was a type of contract in early Rome whereby the debtor, the person borrowing money, pledged his own person as collateral in exchange for the loan. No guesses as to which class was typically the debtors. The exact details around the nexium remain lost to history. It's unclear if this contract was voluntary, or if the contract was entered prior to gaining a debt, or if the contract was entered after the debtor was unable to pay off the debt in any other way. We also do not know what exactly the nexium promised. Perhaps it was labor until repayment of debt, or labor in lieu of interest on debt, or labor in lieu of payment itself, or maybe even labor in exchange for repayment of a previous debt. We just don't know. What we do know is that this type of debt bondage became an epidemic inside of Rome during the 5th century BCE. It was this debt bondage that motivated the plebeians to secede from Rome, and it was this infringement on what most Romans thought of as their own rights that would result in the establishment of the 12 tables. So, to set the scene a little clearer, the two Roman classes, patrician and plebeian, were stuck in a serious conflict. While the plebeians certainly had the numbers and made up the overwhelming majority of Roman citizens, the patricians had the money, political power, and land to put up a serious fight. The plebeians had won a dramatic victory during the first secession, with the establishment of the office of the tribune of the plebs, but there were still quite a few issues to deal with. This all brings us to 462 BCE. That year, the tribune of the plebs, Gaius Terentillus Harsa, decided that he wanted consular powers to be clearly defined. The goal was to stop any abuses of power against the plebeians from a consul. Remember that the office of consul was the direct successor to the office of king. This meant that the limits of consular powers were very blurry, just as the limits of kingly powers were blurry during the Roman kingdom. This allowed the consuls a large amount of personal discretion and leeway in using their powers. Gaius wished to establish a new commission, made up of 5 men, to essentially create a set of guidelines for future consuls. These guidelines would have clearly enumerated the powers held by the consuls and would have greatly curtailed their power. As you can imagine, the patricians were not all that enthused about such an idea. After all, who would want to give up the powers of an office that only your class can hold? Through a united opposition, the patrician elements of the Roman government were able to delay and postpone the consideration and debate of such a law for 8 years. Eventually, in 454 BCE, the plebeians finally gave up, and instead pushed for the establishment of a different commission. This commission would be made up of equal numbers of plebeians and patricians. Sources differ on the exact numbers, and would, quote, enact what would be useful to both orders and secure equal liberty for each, end quote. The patricians responded that they would be fine with that, but that only patricians could serve on such a commission. Surely they could not abuse such a power, right? Right? Anyways, Livy and Dionysius tell us that shortly after the acceptance of such a commission, the Roman Senate authorized an embassy to set out for the cities of Greece, with a particular focus on the city of Athens, to study the systems of government and laws of the various city-states. Livy tells us that of special interest was the Solion Constitution of Athens. The actual historiography of such an expedition is kinda doubtful. It is certainly possible that Rome sent envoys out to study other constitutions and laws, and it's even possible that those envoys journeyed to Athens and other cities within Greece proper. But many historians argue that Rome did not do any such thing, or that they only sent envoys to the Greek cities of southern Italy, an operation that would have been much easier to undertake. Whatever the case, in 452 BCE, either with the knowledge of laws and constitution of Athens, or not, the plebeian tribunes began to press for the commission to be created. The Senate agreed to appoint a commission of 10 men, called a Decemviri, literally Latin for 10 men, to create a collection of rights and duties of Roman citizens. This particular Decemviri was called the Decemviri Consulari Imperio Legibus Scribundus, or the Decemviries with consular power for writing laws. I'm sure you can guess from the naming convention just what the Decemviri was supposed to do. This new Decemviri was given the ultimate power of the Roman state. The office of the consuls and the tribune of the plebs would be suspended, and their decisions would not be subject to any sort of appeal. Think of the Decemviri as a collection of 10 men who were essentially all named dictators. That was the sort of power they held. At first, the plebeians pushed hard for some of their own number to be included on the new commission, but after a lengthy debate, we are told that the plebeian tribunes gave up, and agreed to a patrician-only commission in exchange for guarantees that a law that they had recently passed, we have no clue which law, would not be vetoed nor overturned by either the commission, the Senate, or any future consuls. And so, finally, in 451 BCE, the two newly elected consuls, Appius Claudius Crassus Inregiliensis Sabinus and Titus Genensis Argensis, both resigned along with all other magistrates and plebeian tribunes. This meant that there were only two fonts of political power within Rome. They were the newly created Decemviri and the Senate. The Decemviri consisted of 10 different patrician men. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce all those Latin names. All you need to know is that the two would-be consuls for the year were given seats in exchange for their resignation, and that Appius Claudius, one of the would-be consuls, was without a doubt the most influential member of the commission. Livy says that Appius was, quote, the guiding hand in the whole magistracy, thanks to the favor of the plebs. Each day a different decemvir presided over the magistracy, and that man had 12 lictors, a type of bodyguard given to those who held imperium, which was the same number as the consuls. We are told that their rule was fair, and that despite being granted supreme power that could not be appealed, the group yielded to one another and asked for feedback from the people in the Senate. They would draft their laws on 10 pieces of bronze and display them for all Romans to see. Now wait a minute. At the start of the video I mentioned the 12 tables, not the 10 tables. Yes, that was not a mistake. For you see, even before the decemvir had finished their job, we are told that there was a, quote, general feeling that 2 more tables of laws were needed to fully encapsulate all of Roman law. And so, after this decemvir had written their 10 tables, a new decemvir was elected to write 2 more. We are told that the second decemvir, which consisted of these men, was not nearly as fair nor honorable as the first iteration. Apparently, Appius Claudius, the most influential member of both decemvirs, rigged the election and ensured that the other 9 men were made up of his own supporters. This time, each member of the decemvir was granted the right to have 12 lictors at all times, and in addition, these 12 lictors were allowed to carry axes, even though the possession of weapons within the city of Rome was strictly forbidden. We are told that the sight of the 120 lictors was frightening to everyone, patrician and plebeian alike. We are told that this decemvir held trials behind closed doors, issued judgments that were seemingly arbitrary, and even wanted to crown themselves as the ultimate rulers of Rome. Eventually, this decemvir issued the final 2 tables, and the people looked forward to elections, as the decemvir's mandate was now at an end. However, these elections never came, and instead, the decemvir continued to rule. At some point, we are told that a Sabine army attacked Roman territory, and then an army of Aqui attacked a Roman ally. Livy tells us that the decemvir summoned the Senate to decide what to do, and to issue the orders for the summoning of the legions. The Senate did not show up. The plebeians viewed this as a denouncement of the decemvir as illegitimate and began to consider boycotting the military draft. However, the decemvir called for the Senate a second time, and this time some senators attended. These senators actually launched into a large-scale denouncement of the decemvir. They called the members of the decemvir private citizens and refused to issue a call for levies. This denouncement, though, did not last for very long, as eventually they gave in and allowed a call for levies to go through, as they feared that if they continued their opposition to the decemvir, it may empower the plebeian tribunes, as the plebeians of Rome could very well launch a popular uprising. The plebeians, fearing violent reprisals, begrudgingly enlisted, and 2 armies were created. Each army was led by a few members of the decemvir, and each army was routed as the men of the decemvir proved to be incompetent military leaders. At the same time, Appius Claudius apparently had his eye on a young woman named Verginia. Verginia was the daughter of a plebeian centurion, Lucius Verginius. Appius had been unsuccessful in wooing the woman through promises of riches or power, and thus decided to have one of his men claim her as a slave while her father was absent. The man apparently seized Verginia in the forum and dragged her into a courtroom. During this whole episode, a crowd had gathered and followed the man into the court. Appius Claudius had appointed himself as the judge in the case, and the man claimed that Verginia had been born at his own house, and that he had given her to Lucius Verginius, but that in the end she was still his own slave. Verginia and her defenders asked for an adjournment until her father could attend the trial, and that Verginia be put into the custody of the defendants. Appius agreed to an adjournment. However, he ordered Verginia into the custody of the claimant, the man loyal to Appius. In the meantime, messengers were sent to Lucius Verginius and his commanders, asking for Lucius to be granted leave. At the same time, Appius had sent letters that ordered the commanders to seize and arrest Lucius in order to stop him from coming to Rome. Sadly, for Appius at least, his letters arrived too late, and Lucius was granted leave to deal with the issue. Upon Lucius's arrival in Rome, he led his daughter and a crowd of supporters to the Forum, where he appealed to the rest of the Romans present for support. We are told that the crowd seemed to be in support of Lucius and Verginia. However, Appius, as the judge, ordered Verginia given over to his supporter as a slave without even hearing the arguments from Lucius. The crowd was apparently stunned. As the lictors approached to take Verginia into custody, Lucius shouted that he had betrothed Verginia to a man named Lucilius, not to Appius Claudius, and that he did not bring her up for dishonor. Appius then threatened Lucius by claiming to know that Lucius had attended seditious meetings, and ordered Lucius to be silent and the lictors to take Verginia into custody. Verginius then stabbed his daughter to death, saying that that was the only way he could assert her freedom. Appius ordered his arrest, but the crowd protected him as he made his way to the city gate. We are told that after this episode, Appius ordered the arrest of Verginia's lover and betrothed, Lucilius, but that the crowd again prevented this. This time, 2 patricians, Lucius Valerius Potitus and Marcus Horatius Barbatus, stood between the lictors and Lucilius and told the lictors, quote, if Appius proceeded legally, they would protect Lucilius from the prosecution of a mere citizen. If he sought to make use of violence, there too they would be a match for him. Pretty badass, right? After this, the 3 men, Appius Claudius, Lucius Valerius, and Marcus Horatius, all made speeches before the crowd. We are told that the crowd booed Appius, and only really listened to Lucius and Marcus. Appius fled, probably in fear for his life, and one of the other decemvirs, not knowing what to do, ordered the Senate to assemble. The senators were openly hostile to the decemvir, and there was hope that the Senate would act to depose the men. However, the Senate, in fear of further plebeian resistance, simply sent messengers with orders to ensure that the soldiers within the 2 armies did not rise up. In the meantime, Lucius Verginius, who apparently had been followed by some 400 men, arrived back at the Roman encampment. He told his fellow soldiers, quote, to look out for themselves and for their own children, and they replied that they, quote, would not forget his sufferings, nor failed to vindicate their liberty. The men who had come from Rome with Lucius then urged the soldiers to rise up, saying that Appius had fled into exile and that the decemvir had been overthrown. The soldiers, apparently from the army that had been tasked with dealing with the Aqui, agreed and marched back to Rome. Here they took possession of the Aventine Hill, from which they urged the plebeians to regain their freedoms by electing new tribunes. The Senate decided to take no harsh action, and instead sent 3 envoys to discover who was leading the group on the Aventine and what their demands were. The soldiers did not have a distinct leader, but the civilian crowd wanted Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius to be the envoys to the Senate, while the military men decided, with the input of Lucius Verginius, to elect 10 men who would serve as military tribunes. At the same time, Licilius had apparently gone to the other army and convinced them to join the army that now controlled the Aventine. Licilius and this army also elected their own military tribunes and set out for Rome. Upon their arrival, the newly elected tribunes decided to name 2 men, Marcus Oppius and Sextus Manilius, as the ultimate commanders of the forces. The Senate, at least according to Livy, spent most of their time bickering between themselves. They eventually decided to send Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius as envoys to the Aventine on the condition that the Decemviri resign their offices. The Decemviri responded that they would only do so if their 2 tables were passed into law. The soldiers and the crowds of plebeians had apparently decided enough was enough, and decided to follow the example from decades previous and secede to the Mons Secour. Here they demanded the reinstatement of the plebeian tribunes. The Senate hesitated on what to do. Some hated the plebeians so much that they had no wish to bring back the tribunes, no matter the circumstances. Others, such as Valerius and Horatius, argued that the restoration of the tribunes would actually be a vital step in getting rid of the Decemviri and returning to normal political order. Eventually, the Decemviri agreed to resign, and thus allow the election of both consuls and tribunes, in exchange for protection against any personal reprisals for their actions while in office. Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius were sent to the Mons Secour to discuss these terms with the plebeians. The 2 men were well received, as the plebeians remembered their actions in the forum. The plebeians demanded 4 things: the recovery of the protections the plebeians enjoyed through the plebeian tribunes, the right to appeal, immunity for those who incited the rebellion, and harsh punishment for the Decemviri. Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius agreed on the first 3 demands, and asked that the issue of punishment be postponed. The plebeians accepted, and thus ended the Second Plebeian Secession. Whew, that kind of got away from me there. This is where we will pause our first part of our examination. The plebeians had just successfully orchestrated the downfall of the tyrannous Second Decemvir through the effective use of secession. Now they needed to first elect their new tribunes, while the patricians elected new consuls, and then they could get down to finally displaying the newly created 12 tables. Would these 12 tables avert future disasters such as the one we just talked about? Would the 12 tables actually protect the plebeians? And would the plebeians accept the new tables? Join me next time as we answer all of those questions and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. This episode sort of got away from me. It was supposed to be a simple examination on the 12 tables. However, as I researched more and more, I felt that we really needed to expand the background of the story to do the 12 tables justice. So hopefully this all makes sense, and you will join me next time where we actually talk about the tables themselves. If you have any further comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.